Thanks for doing this, Bob. Good morning, everybody. Bob, as I'm sure nearly all of you know, spent many years at Goldman Sachs, ultimately as co-chairman, was the first ever director of the National Economic Council under Bill Clinton, was Treasury Secretary, of course, and has been vice chairman of Citigroup and now co-chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations, and is a native of New York City, like me. So we're here obviously to talk about the economy and talk about politics. It's funny, when I've been having these conversations over the last few years, I feel like they're always so dark when we talk about the economy, right? And now I feel like there are little bits of signs of lightness. And I guess I want to ask you whether we should begin to start to get a little more optimistic. The census report on income last year showed really healthy gains up and down the spectrum. We don't know about this year, but wages still seem to be outpacing inflation. It's really hard to see economic turning points, right? And people were depressed in the early 90s, and then we went into this great boom. Is there any reason to think and hope that we're at the beginning of a period where we're finally going to start to see more consistent improvements in living standards for most Americans?
Well, I think, David, it sort of depends what time period you're talking about a little bit. I guess my view would be as follows. I think that the 2015 numbers, though encouraging, are one-year numbers. There was a Federal Reserve Board study, I think came out in May, that said that something like 31% of the American people self-identify as struggling. It said that something like 45% of Americans couldn't raise $400 within a short period of time if they had an emergency. So I think that the answer in terms of how people are doing is still that a very large number of Americans are struggling. And I think we face very serious policy issues in our country. But in a broader sense, what I think, David, looking out beyond the immediate future, but looking out to the longer term, we have enormous strengths and comparative advantages. And I think we have the potential to do very well over a long period of time. And when I say very well, I think of it in terms of three objectives: growth, widespread participation, the benefits of growth, and economic security. And I think they're mutually reinforcing. And in fact, I don't think you'll get growth unless you have broad-based participation, and I don't think you'll get widely increasing incomes unless you have growth. But that gets you then to what I think is the essential and determinative factor with respect to our future. We face enormous policy challenges. We need public investment, we need structural reform in all kinds of areas, from criminal justice reform, which I think is an economic issue, as well as obviously an individual issue for those involved. We need to overcome poverty, we need infrastructure. I said infrastructure in terms of public investment. We need immigration reform. We need all kinds of measures to deal with the pressures that are being created by technological development and by globalization. And I think this is all doable substantively, David, but it does come down to the question of whether or not our political system is going to function effectively. And I believe, and this will be my last observation on that, I believe that our economic future, both in terms of growth and how the broad sway of American people do, that is to say, whether we have widespread income increases and economic security, is going to be absolutely dependent on whether or not our political system reestablishes sufficient functionality to meet our policy challenges. And that really, in my judgment, at least comes down to the question of whether Congress, unlike its history of the recent past, reestablishes that functionality.
So the classic thing for a journalist or someone from a think tank or in Washington to say is, the two parties just need to agree more. And I guess I'd be interested in your thoughts about the fact that you're obviously a Democrat, right? But you're not known as a left-wing Democrat. When I look at things...
Probably right. Depends on whose perspective you have, but I think that's probably right.
That's true. Some people would say all Democrats are left-wing.
Yep. A lot of people I know would say that, but go ahead.
When I look at the two parties today, by no means, speaking personally, do I think the Democrats are right on every issue. There are some issues in which I find the conservative argument stronger. But in terms of party functionality, to me the Democrats are a functioning party and the Republicans are not. They don't want to govern, they don't want to pass things. They've just nominated really the most irresponsible candidate for president in our lifetime. And so what I struggle with is this question that Norm Ornstein talks a lot about of there is not symmetry between the two parties. They're both right about some things and wrong about some things. But to me, the problem is that we don't have a functioning center-right party in this country. Do you disagree with that?
Well, I guess I think of it a little bit differently, David. I think that in both, I am very much a Democrat. I think in both parties, the more extreme elements of the party are where the energy is right now. I do think we do not have a symmetry. I think that the Freedom Caucus in the House has fundamentally been opposed to governing, and that is a major problem for our country. So I think the question now, assuming for the moment current polls hold and Hillary gets elected to president, I think the critical question for our country will be, is the Congress going to engage with Hillary and the Democrats to govern, and that is to say, to engage in principled compromise, to focus on facts and analysis, although politics is obviously always very important, to make difficult decisions so that in respect to our critical challenges we can legislate, or is it going to be like the last 6 years in which is fundamentally almost complete dysfunction in our system? And if we have that complete dysfunction, I think we will pay an ever-increasing cost for it, and over the longer run, if that continues, I think we will languish. If to the contrary, we meet our challenges, as I said earlier, I think we can do very well. I'm not licensed to practice politics, but my instinct is that, well, I'm not. I had a debate once with Jim Baker, and he ended the debate by saying, "You're not licensed to practice politics." I said, "You're right. I just happen to be right on this issue." But anyway, but be that as it may, you know, David, politics changes so rapidly in America, and it's true. I think there is a certain asymmetry at the present time, but that could change, and it could change rapidly. It depends what happens.
Yeah, no, and in the past, it in some ways has been flipped. You know Hillary Clinton.
Yep.
How optimistic are you that you talk about the 6 years of virtual paralysis? How optimistic are you that a significant portion of that stems from failures by the Obama administration and that she can do a better job than they did? And how much, alternately, maybe there's a third option, do you think there wasn't much more the Obama administration could do to forge compromise, and therefore we should be pessimistic that she'll be able to?
I think leaving aside whether the Obama issue, although I do think, I mean, to be critical, that Senator McConnell at the very beginning said that what we're going to do is do whatever we can to oppose this president.
Yes,
so it's not a very good way to begin a new administration if your objective is to govern. But I think she's going to be terrific at reaching out. I used to know her pretty well. In the 2 years I was in the White House, my office was three offices away from hers. So I used to spend a lot of time with her. I thought she was terrific. I think she's smart. I think she's a progressive, but I'd call her a pragmatist with progressive values. I think she'd be very good at reaching out. I don't think that's the question. I think the question is, will the House, assuming the House remains in Republican hands, which certainly current polls suggest a high probability, will the House engage with her to govern? And I think that is the critical and the dispositive issue with respect to the longer-term future of our country. And I think it's going to make a very big difference with respect to the short term, because basically we have right now a slow recovery. Yes, 2015 was good it was favorable. It was a substantial improvement in terms of, as you correctly say, wages increasing at all levels. But if you look at 2016 and you look at the data, and also you look at some of the Fed Reserve study that I mentioned and so forth, I think fundamentally we're still in a period of very sluggish wage growth. Most Americans are not participating in the growth that is taking place, and I think there's a lot we can do about that. But while you can do some things by executive action, fundamentally we need legislation.
When I was in Philadelphia to cover the Democratic Convention this year, I was really struck by how many signs there were that said no TPP. I mean, there were hundreds and hundreds of signs about the Pacific trade deal. I think there's a fair debate to have about whether trade has been more harmful to people than the Washington consensus has acknowledged. But I just see absolutely no evidence that trade is as important, and trade deals are as important to the struggles of the American worker, that it has taken on the totemic significance it's taken on. However, it's taken on this significance. Do you see any way that Hillary can sign some version of the TPP, or is it effectively dead?
Well, I'm going to leave that question to Hillary and the people around her. But I think there's a larger question, David. David Autor, a very highly distinguished economist at MIT, wrote a piece recently in which he said that there's no question that we're in transcendent or transforming, a period of transforming economic conditions. And predominantly technology, but also globalization, in addition to contributing to growth, is also having or creating serious pressures on wages and serious pressures on jobs. And I think in response to that, we need to meet our policy challenges. And some of those are the conventional challenges that we always talk about. We need public investment. Question of how you pay, infrastructure, basic research, et cetera. Question of how you pay for it, is, whether deficit funding or various other ways, is, I think, a debate that needs to be had. We need structural reform in all kinds of areas. We need, for example, fair laws with respect to collective bargaining so that workers can make their choice on a level playing field. We need immigration reform, as I mentioned before, criminal justice reform. We need to overcome poverty. We need to, I at least think we need to have some sort of a framework that applies the benefits versus costs to our regulatory structure, and so much else. And if we do all of that, and then we absolutely need to address our intermediate and longer-term fiscal trajectory, which are unsound and I think in multiple ways very risky for our economy and for our working people. But if we do all that, David, then I think within that context, we will be addressing the wage pressures and the dislocational wage pressures, if you will, and job pressures that trade and far more importantly technology have created. And I think it could change the attitude toward trade. That attitude actually is not spread to technology, even though technological development is far the greater factor in terms of these pressures.
What about Wall Street, where obviously you spent so much of your career? I'm going to guess that you don't agree with...
I want to say one more thing on trade. I think look, when President Clinton was there, we were, he was very much in favor of trade liberalization. Even President Clinton, who had these enormous political skills, never was really able to explain to the American people the benefits of trade. But I think the key now is to address the dislocations that technology predominantly, but also trade are creating. And if we do that, then I think we can create a virtuous cycle in which there's broad support for policies that fundamentally are very good on balance for our economy, but do have, as I say, these pressures that need to be addressed.
You could see the political difficulty during the debate. I mean, Hillary's only bad 10 minutes during that debate was the stuff about trade, politically. So Wall Street.
Yes.
I'm sure you disagree with some of the critiques of Wall Street from both the left and the right, but it's clear that there's a broadly held sense in this country now that Wall Street has done things that make life harder for a lot of Americans. I'd be interested in your thoughts about what do you think should change about the way our government policy treats Wall Street?
Well, I think that's a complicated question. Look, in 2008, we had the worst financial crisis since the 1930s. And there were a lot of people, and I included myself, who thought that we had developed excesses before that, David. But virtually nobody, and you look at the Fed transcripts, you can see it certainly included the Fed, but virtually nobody saw the full panoply of powerful forces that would work and interacted with negative feedback loops to create what turned out to be, as I say, the worst crisis in 2008. There was a lesson in that, and the lesson in that was that the downside of our system was far worse than virtually anybody saw, and therefore, including, I might add, myself, and therefore, we needed to have reform, and out of that came Dodd-Frank. I think there are parts of Dodd-Frank, like the Consumer Protection Agency, the material on derivatives, although I think we should have done considerably more in derivatives, as I said in my book, which came out in 2003 and still available in paperback for those who are interested. And there's no quota on the number of copies you can buy. It's unlimited. I think there's more that we can do. Other parts of Dodd-Frank, the parts that limited the Fed's ability to intervene with respect to crisis, I think could turn out to be counterproductive. But it was very important that we address the issues, and it was very important that we have a stimulus bill to try to get us back on track. I think in terms of Wall Street today, I get the impression that you're sort of right, that there's a kind of a relatively negative attitude toward Wall Street.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I noticed that, including, I might add, in the New York Times, with all due respect. But I do think we need, no modern economy can function effectively without what is, in some fair measure, a market-based economics, a market-based financial system. And that, I think, is something that we need to recognize in our legislation, our regulation, but then we also have to deal with the kinds of problems that 2008 manifested. So I think we need a balance, and I think the pendulum politically has shifted toward a non-balanced view of trying to deal with, actually, there's a very complicated question, which is how do you have an effective market-based system and not have the kinds of issues that arose in 2008?
David Bradley, one of our hosts here, is a master interviewer, and he gave me an idea before we came on stage, which is I want to ask you to imagine that you are graduating from college now. When you graduated from college in the 1960s, you went off to law school, you joined a...
No, I didn't.
You did not? You
I went to law school for 3 days, I dropped out, and I went to London School of Economics for a year, which was a great year.
And then to law school?
Yeah, and then I came back to law school.
Okay.
Okay. but I had a wonderful year in London with no responsibilities, didn't cost much. The dollar was a terrific thing to have, and I had a great time.
Excellent. So I want you to imagine that you were graduating from college today, and let's say you go off to London and you have that great year, and then you're coming back, and let's imagine you had a lot of options, as you did when you actually graduated college. What would you consider to be, in this society, in this economy, with all of our benefits and all of our challenges, what do you see as the most attractive and important and engaging things for a young person to do? What do you imagine being drawn to if you were 23 years old today?
Well, you know, David, from very early on in my life, I wanted to be in the political arena in some fashion or other. I knew I'd never run for office. I'm not equipped for it. It's not my nature and so forth. But I really did, from a very early age, hoped that someday I could be part of the political process, partly because I was fascinated with how our system worked, and partly because even when I was younger, even more so later, but there's a lot I believed in, and I thought if I could get into government, I could be involved in trying to pursue and advance the issues I believed in. Whether I'd start that way is a different question. And I guess if I were graduating today, look, the area that is most promising and that in a financial sense probably is to get involved in the technological world in some fashion or other. Wall Street's become a very, very different place, and I do think there are some aspects of the financial world that still are interesting and promising, and I think I would at least think about. But I think it's very different than when I graduated.
How has it changed?
The big firms have become very big. The regulatory environment is extremely difficult. There's obviously, as you pointed out, a very negative public attitude toward Wall Street. And I think the financial industry as a whole, but I think there's some exceptions to this, as a whole, is going to have could well have a difficult time for a long time. So and these are big most of these are big public companies today. That's very different. When I went, Goldman Sachs was a small partnership. And that's just a very, very different environment. But whatever I did, I would try to do again what I was fortunate enough to be able to do in that day and age, so it was easier to do then than now, is in addition to focusing on my job and doing the best I could and the best I was able to accomplish, given whatever I had brought to it, I would try to get myself involved in civic and political activities outside of my job. I think it makes life a lot more interesting. You meet all kinds of people you wouldn't otherwise have known. And in my case, at least, it gave me the opportunity, both in civic activity and then ultimately in political activity, to pursue objectives and values and ideas I had about what our world should be like that I very much wanted to be involved in pursuing.
It reminds me of something, which is, for all of our problems as a society, when you look at the polling, the group that is most optimistic about the future of our country are the same young people who've struggled the most economically over the last generation. 20-somethings and 30-somethings have paid the highest price from this economy, and yet are far more optimistic than people in their 50s, 60s, and 70s.
Well, maybe they just don't understand it as well.
Thank you very much, Bob.
Thank you, David.